Good, so do open up Psalm 78 again. There's a lot there, and we will be sort of skimming the whole thing, but we'll be getting the main lesson out from this of what it is Asaph wants to pass on to his children, and indeed to us. What lesson is it that you want to pass on to your children? You might want them to learn about history or zoology or any of these other things, or music. You might want your children to grow up to be great linguists or great musicians. But what's the most fundamental thing that you want them to learn from you? You might see people posting on their social media or whatever, going, "I'm hoping that my child is, he's learning from me to be a great strong person, a really strong character. I'm hoping that my daughter will grow up to be a strong woman, or my son will grow up to be a man who can stand up for himself." What is it that you really want your children to know and to understand and to learn from you? Do you want them to be like you? It might be a sort of two-edged thing to that, mightn't there? Do you want your children to learn to be like you? Now, what Asaph is saying here is what God wants parents to pass on to their children. And the reason for that is because this is the most important thing that anyone could learn. You learn best from your parents. You're with your parents. You see them all the time. What is it your parents are passing on to you? What are you going to pass on to the next generation? And Asaph thinks this is the most important thing for anyone to hear. And so he is focused on passing this on, not just to his children, but to the nation and to the people. You can see here the generations it's meant to be passed down. I think there's 4 or 5 generations here, aren't they? Our fathers told us we're going to not hide them from their children, so we're telling the rest of our generation. And then he says, verse 4, we'll tell to the coming generation, that's the third, isn't it? Our children, the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. And then he explains that God has commanded our fathers to teach their children, that's 2 generations, so that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, that's our children, our children's children, and they arise and tell them to their children. There's 4 or 5 generations in there. God's purpose is this is passed on from generation to generation. What is the message that Asaph and that God is passing on in this psalm? Very simply in verse 4, it's the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. It's what God is like, what God has done, and what God has done through history. This is a very historical psalm. It takes the people of Israel back through their immediate history over the past 500 years in Asaph's day. And over that period, he's walking through what God has done for them. And the lesson he wants them to take from it is not be like me and learn to be a strong character. It's actually, don't be like your fathers. Don't be like your fathers, verse 8. They should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. So as we look through this psalm, there's going to be 2 big things that Asaph is saying to us through it. First of all, he's going to take us through man's cycle of failure and how God does things, but man ignores them, and man keeps failing. And then finally, he's going to bring us on to God's permanent solution to this cycle of failure. What's God done to solve that? So first of all, we're going to look at man's cycle of failure and skim through everything that Asaph is telling us about that, what God does and how people respond in this psalm. I don't know if you noticed as we read through, but there's sort of 3 big themes. I'm just bringing up my bits of paper so I can see the whole psalm here. There's 3 big themes that go through all of this history. God constantly is giving to his people. He gives them water, he gives them bread, he gives them meat, he gives them freedom from Egypt, he gives them his forgiveness. He finally gives them the land for their own, brings them into it, and gives them an inheritance. God gives. Then there's what people do in response to that. And remember, the people that Asaph's talking about through here are not people who don't know about God. These are the people of Israel, the people whom God has chosen, whom God has spoken to, revealed himself to, and God has done all these things for. What do they do? Well, we'll go in some more detail, but basically they rebel against God. They go, we don't want to do things your way. We want to do things our way. And they're ungrateful to him. And then the third thing that runs all the way through this is that God is then angry with them. God is angry with them. His anger rises against them and he deals with them. But yet then it goes back around that cycle. Even though God is angry, he still gives. Even though he's giving, they still rebel. Because he's rebelling, he is angry. But even though he's angry, he still gives. And this cycle goes all the way through this psalm, as indeed that cycle goes through not just those 500 years of history, but the whole of human history. God gives, man rebels, God is angry, but yet God still, in his mercy, gives. Now, Psalm 78, it picks up from Psalm 77, which we're not reading as well, because that would take too long. But Psalm 77 takes us up to the point of the Exodus. And Psalm 78 is taking us from that point, first of all, through that whole generation of the Israelites who came out of the land of Egypt and were then wandering in the wilderness on their way to the land of Canaan. And the majority of the psalm takes us through that generation and how they responded to what God had done. And just first of all, it starts in verse 9. You find out the Ephraimites are the ringleaders. They're one of the 12 tribes of Israel. We'll come back to Ephraim later on. But what do? They turn back in verse 9. They don't keep God's covenant in verse 10. They refuse to walk according to God's law. And they forget God's works. All the way through this whole period of history and all the way through history, what people do is characterized, first of all, by forgetting what God has done. That was the root of the problem, if you like, of what's going on in this whole story. They forget and they refuse to believe what God has done, and they refuse to trust him to do it again. Yet, verses 12 to 16, God has rescued them from Egypt. He gives them drink. Verse 17, they sin against him still more. They rebel against him. They test God. They speak against God. And so God is full of wrath in verse 21. And yet God gives. He gives them bread to eat. He gives them meat to eat in verses 23 to 29. But God is angry with them because they rebel against him in verses 30 down to verse 33. And in spite of his anger, they still sin against him. Regardless of whether God gives or whether God shows his anger and his judgment, they still continue to ignore him. In verse 34, it seems like finally they're seeking God, and it seems like they're repenting and turning back to him. But verse 36 tells us that they're actually flattering him, they're lying to him, because nothing has changed inside, and they're just putting on a show because they want to get out of trouble. Yet, even in that situation, in verse 38, God still gives to them. He restrains his anger. He still cares for them. But they continue to rebel against him in the desert. And this brings us all the way up to, finally, in where we have the whole story of what happened in Egypt, first of all, the reminder of how God had rescued them. But then finally, in verses 52 to 55, God is bringing them into the land of Canaan. Finally, they're out of the desert, they're out of the wilderness, and finally they're going to arrive. God led out his people like sheep. He guided them in the wilderness like a flock, verse 52. He led them in safety so they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain which his right hand had won. He drove out the nations before them, he apportioned them for a possession, and he settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. Despite everything that they've been doing and the rebellion against God through 40 years in the wilderness, God gives them a land. He settles them in it. And you think, surely here is a new start. This is going to be the point where the people now say, we are so thankful to God. Look at what God's done for us. He not only brought us out of Egypt, but he's brought us now through the wilderness. He's brought us into the promised land, a land that flows with milk and honey, where we have everything we could possibly need. Everything we could possibly want. Another generation is this another chance. This is where man finally sorts himself out. But it's not, is it? How do they react to God giving them the land and settling them in it? Verse 56, yet they tested, rebelled, did not keep his laws, they turned away, they acted treacherously just like their fathers. They provoke him to anger with their idolatry. Everything happens exactly the same all over again. All over again. Now, this passage, these 3 verses here, really, 56 to 58, it sums up about, 300-400 years of history. Everything that happens in the book of the Judges in the Old Testament. And if you read through the book of Judges, you can see that whole story is a story of exactly the same thing happening. I'm not going to read the whole book of Judges as well this morning, but go home and do that, and you'll find that God rescues the people. Then for a while everything is good and God blesses them, and then they turn away from him. They forget what God has done for them. They turn off and they worship idols. They worship the idols of the people around them. And what happens? Well, God judges them. He brings their enemies against them. They cry to God for help. He rescues them, and there's a cycle that goes round and round and round and round for 300 or 400 years. And finally, verse 59, it seems like God's patience has finally run out as we get to the end of the book of Judges and the beginning, if you're reading through the Old Testament, the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel. What does God do? Verse 59, when God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among mankind. Going back to Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, who were the ringleaders of all this trouble, they'd settled right in the middle of the land of Israel, and in the tribe of Ephraim was the town of Shiloh, and that was where God's special tabernacle, where the people would come and worship God, that's where that was located. There in the center of the tribe of Ephraim, in the center of the land of Israel. And for 300 or 400 years, the people had been going to Shiloh to worship God, but then they'd be going home and worshiping idols and refusing to obey God, refusing to do what he says. And so now God forsakes his dwelling at Shiloh. He's no longer dwelling with his people. They're no longer able to go there and worship him. It says he delivers his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. And you can read about this, what happened in the book of 1 Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 4. Again, I'm not going to read it all now, but what happened was that finally, the Ark of the Covenant, which sat at the center of the temple, or the tabernacle in those days, it was the centerpiece of the worship of God, it was captured by the enemies. After being there in that tabernacle for 400 years, their enemies, the Philistines, they capture the ark. They take it away. And the people of Israel are defeated. And it seems like everything has come to an end. And that chapter closes with the priests have been killed. The widow of the priest is dying, and on her deathbed she says she has just given birth. She dies in childbirth. And she names the child Ichabod, because she says the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. It seems like the worship of God has come to an end. Everything has come to a complete stop. It seems like God has forsaken and abandoned the people of Israel. Verse 60 of the psalm again, he forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among mankind. He delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people over to the sword, vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men. Their young women had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and the widows made no lamentation. This is the cycle that the people have got themselves into, by again and again and again forgetting what God has done, refusing to believe that he'll do what he says, and refusing to keep his commandments. Now, this cycle of failure isn't just something that happens during this particular period of Israel's history. You can read the rest of the Old Testament and you find it keeps happening throughout the history. You can read if you're interested in history like Miles, you can read any history of any nation, and you find that people continue to do the same thing. However much God gives, people refuse to submit to him. However much God judges, people refuse to submit to him. What about us? What about us today? And this is important for us as a nation, and it's important for us as individuals as well. Do we feel like we are stuck in a cycle of failure like that? Because that is where we end up without God's intervention, which we'll come on to in a second. Do we really think that we achieve what we set out to do we're stuck in this cycle where we try one thing after another and everything seems to fail. It could be you personally. You think that you're going to achieve this and then you don't. You think you're going to sort this out and you don't. I'm going to turn my life around, but you can't. I'm going to stop doing this, but you keep going back to it. It could be your relationships with other people. I think I'm going to be the best husband ever, the best father ever. I'm not going to make the mistakes my parents made, and then you find that you're making more mistakes than they did. You're stuck in that same cycle. And it's not just your relationships with other people, is it? It's crucially in this psalm, it's your relationship with God and where that is going. How are you relating to God? And is it where you think it should be? Because I think for most people, you can look at that and go, my life is not what I think it should be, let alone what God thinks it should be. The people of Israel, they kept realizing this, and throughout the whole time of the Judges, there'd be a time where they'd go, oh, yes, we need to come back to God. We need to go back to him and worship him. And they'd try it for a bit, and they'd go, but it's more fun doing this. And they leave it, and they go and do something else. Man's stuck in this cycle of failure. And this is what Asaph is pointing out to us in this psalm. That not only does this here are the things which God does, but here's what man does. And why what man does is so hopeless and helpless, and it doesn't get him anywhere. But what he wants to get onto is the final verses here, which I want to focus in on. And we'll tie in a bit to the rest of the psalm as well. He wants to get us onto God's permanent solution. What is God's solution to this cycle of failure? No matter how much God gives, people still sin, and no matter how much God judges, people still sin. What's God going to do about it? God's permanent solution. How does man break out of this cycle? How do you break out of the cycle of constantly going around and never improving, never getting anywhere? Well, man doesn't break out of it. God breaks into it. And this is what's happening in verse 65. It says, then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine. Asaph has these two seems slightly irreverent seeming pictures of God. It's like he was asleep and now he's going to wake up. He's going to do something different. It's like someone who's drunk some wine and he's getting up and he's shouting about how he's going to save the world. Except in God's case, he is actually going to do it. And it's not that he's duped himself into thinking he can do it. The Lord awoke and he gets up. He's going to do something fundamentally different than anything he's done before. He's not going to simply give and see if people respond in gratitude. He's not going to judge and see if people will respond in fear. What he's going to do is he's going to save. Now, there's two aspects to this that Asaph himself saw beginning. He saw the beginning of what God was going to do and the beginning of how God was saving his people. As I've said, you can read on the history of Israel and you find they still weren't learning and they're still going around in this same cycle. But in Asaph's time, Asaph saw two things happen which were the beginning of God's permanent solution to man's cycle of failure and of how God himself was now going to come and save his people. And the two parts to God's answer are David and God's sanctuary, the temple. God is, remember back in the beginning of this psalm, the tribe of Ephraim were causing loads of trouble. God has now abandoned his dwelling at Shiloh. He's not chosen the tribe of Ephraim in verse 67. Instead, he chooses the tribe of Judah, and he chooses, first of all, a place where his temple is going to be built. Now the temple in Asaph's day was a hugely significant thing. It meant the end of the tent where God's presence had been seen beforehand, and the new permanent place. A tent is something you move around, isn't it? It's here today, it might be gone tomorrow. Now there was going to be a permanent sense of God's presence there in Jerusalem among his people. And then the other thing that Asaph saw was God's choosing of a king. First of all, King Saul, which was an example of a king which didn't work well, and then God's choosing a king after his own heart, which was King David, who God chose and anointed and selected to shepherd and to guide his people. Now, Asaph lived through this amazing, momentous period in Israel's history. He must have been probably a very young man when David was chosen as king. Asaph was there when David first brought the Ark of the Covenant, which had now come back from the land of the Philistines, where it was brought into Jerusalem. And David set up his kingdom there, and he set up the Ark there as being the center of the worship of God. And Asaph was also there. He was still there leading the worship when finally the temple was constructed and the people gathered to worship God, and they saw the fire of God come down from heaven, fill the temple, and God's glory appear in it. So David is going to be God's king to rule and to save them. And then the sanctuary, the temple, is going to be the symbol of God's presence there with them. Now why is this the answer? Why is this what is needed? Because this is how Asaph's presenting it, isn't it? This is where he finishes his psalm. You've had this endless cycle for the past 64 verses, and he says, well, now God is doing something different, and he's building his sanctuary. He's putting his enemies to everlasting shame. He's built his sanctuary like the earth, which he's founded forever, and he's chosen David. Well, the only way that there's going to be any difference made to any person or any people is in God being with them and in God shepherding and guiding them. And this is what God is starting to do and to show in the people of Israel at this time. What is needed is God's permanent presence and God's king, not just to rule and to give commandments, but to shepherd and to guide and to shepherd them. You see the word shepherd there twice, is in verse 71 and 72. He brought David to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. This is different. It's not God simply giving and seeing if people are grateful. And it's not God acting in judgment and seeing if people will fear. But God himself personally intervening with his presence, with his king, to make a difference to people and make a difference to their lives. Now Asaph, of course, was just seeing the beginning of this. And while there was a difference made by David being king, it didn't last. And not all of David's descendants were great kings, and the kingdom eventually crumbled and fell. And while it was great that they had the temple there and they had a place where they could come and they could worship God, the temple was misused. They brought idols into the temple, and they turned the worship of God out of it. And eventually the temple was destroyed and burned to the ground. But what Asaph saw was the beginning of something which God is doing, and which now we see a much more full picture of. What Asaph saw was a bit like if you're waiting on the station for the train to come in, and you see the train coming down the track, and you can just see the driver sitting in his cab, and you go, there's a train coming. But you can't really see the whole train. You can't really see the whole picture. And you can't tell whether it's full or empty, or whether it's got 10 carriages or 4 carriages, until it comes in and it draws up to the platform, and you can finally see there's a train, and you can get on it. What we can see, looking back now over what God has done, as Asaph himself would encourage us to do, is we can see how God has done what he started with David and with the temple, how he's brought that to completion through Jesus, through the new covenant that God has made, and the way that God's presence is now with his people. I'm just going to read a few verses from the book of Acts, because just as Asaph was living at a very momentous time as God starts this whole plan, so the disciples of Jesus, as they began the first church in the book of Acts, they were similarly living at a very momentous time, even more momentous than Asaph's. As Peter gets up to preach in Acts chapter 2, this is the point where the train's coming to the station. Now we can see the full picture of what God is doing. Acts chapter 2, we find that God's presence is now coming down, not in one location in a building, but on each of his people. Acts 2 verse 1, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as a fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. And so, just as Asaph saw God's glory come down on the temple, Peter and the others with him have now seen God's glory come down on each one of his people, showing that God's presence is now permanently with them. Not just permanently there in Jerusalem, so you can go and worship him, but permanently there in you as one of Jesus' people, so that you can constantly worship him, and so that your life is being transformed by him. And as Peter explains to the crowds who gather just what has happened, he links this all back to King David and to what God has now done in providing a much greater king, the King Jesus. Acts chapter 2, skip ahead to verse 32. He talks about Jesus' resurrection. He says, "This Jesus God raised up, and of that we all are witnesses, being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out this, that you yourselves are seeing and hearing. For David did not ascend into the heavens, but he himself says, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies your footstool.' Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." Now, here is the fulfillment of everything that David was there to start. The final son of David, who is not just a king sitting on a throne in Jerusalem, but has ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God until his enemies are made his footstool. A king who will, in a much greater way than David, shepherd his people, guide them with his skillful hand. The king who is the good shepherd, who not only guides his sheep, but lays down his life for his sheep. We now see this full picture, and we read from Revelation 22 at the start of the service. And in Revelation 22, we see the completion of everything that God started in the days of Asaph. In Revelation 22, just read a couple of verses from that. In the new heavens and the new earth, when Jesus' kingdom is completed and handed over to God the Father, this is what we see. God himself is now permanently with his people, and his king is permanently with them in a way that nothing can spoil. Revelation 22 verse 3, "No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads." Permanently, with the glorious throne of God and of the Lamb, with God's name on your forehead, and seeing his face. God's permanent solution to man's cycle of failure. Beginning there in the time of Asaph, we see brought to fulfillment in Jesus Christ, and finally arriving at its destination when Jesus' kingdom is completed. So, man's cycle of failure is dealt with by God. Now, what does Asaph want us to do about this? It's all well to know it, it's all well to hear it, but what does he want us to go away and do? Well, it's very simple. He says there's one lesson that we need to take away from this. It's in verse 7. What should we do? He says, "So that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments." So they should set their hope in God. Where is your hope? Is it on what you might achieve, that you'll be able to sort your life out, you'll be able to deal with that sin, you'll be able to turn things around? Or is it on what God has achieved? Don't forget the works of God, that God is the only one who can break out of man's cycle of failure, break into it and break us out of it. Don't forget what he's done, Asaph says, and instead learn to keep his commandments, because you hope in him and trust in him.